Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to this webinar on product cybersecurity. This is part one of two. Today we'll be covering the minimum legal requirements as they are today. But please do register for our next webinar next week, July 22nd at 3 o'clock BST. This is part two, CRA, Cyber Resilience Act. Are you ready for 2027? This is me. I'm Alex Toohie. My background is in radio testing and EMC testing. More recently, I've moved over into the cybersecurity side of things, and that's why I'm here today talking to you about these minimum legal requirements for cybersecurity on products. What we'll try to cover today, we've only got 30 minutes, but we'll try to cover cybersecurity basics. So what is cybersecurity? Why are we all having this conversation today? We'll talk about the legislation as it is today, the timeline leading up to today, and then what the future will hold. We'll look in more detail at the PSTI requirements, which are specific to the UK, and we'll look at the RED requirements, the Radio Equipment Directive requirements, which apply in the EU. So first of all, let's look at cybersecurity basics. Let's answer the question, what is cybersecurity? If you were to look up a definition, you'd see something like this that says security against electronic attacks, such as cyber warfare or cyber terrorism. But fundamentally, it's those electronic attacks or digital attacks that we're concerned with protecting against. So why are people carrying out these sort of attacks anyway? There are lots of various motivations that people could be following. These are some of the biggest ones, and actually the one at the top left here is the one that we see most often on the sort of products that we generally cover. So a hardware product. And this is for generally IoT type devices get targeted to assemble a botnet. And what we mean by a botnet is a large number of devices which have been compromised with some malicious software that does nothing for long periods of time other than just tries to add more devices into this network. But they are maliciously controlled by an actor who can turn these on at some point effectively. So all of these devices suddenly start acting to carry out these distributed denial of service attacks, a DDoS attack, which is very, very difficult to mitigate against once that attack happens. We also see network devices being used as points of entry to secure networks to steal information. A really great example of this, and I'm sure many of you will have heard this before, but there was a fish tank in a casino foyer in Vegas. That fish tank had a wireless thermometer in it. That was hacked, because it had access to that relatively secure network. It gave attackers a way in to exfiltrate large amounts of data. We see things like security cameras being accessed and used to assist criminal activity. So if you can access a security camera that's protecting a facility, you can potentially use that to plan attack or help an attack while it's happening. And then obviously we see smart devices being used to steal data, whether that's financial data or just monitoring location data of an individual. And then what are the weaknesses that exist in products that allow these malicious actors to carry out these attacks? Again, there are various different weaknesses, but here are some of the big four that we see. And the top one has got to be universal passwords. So it's quite common that you would buy a device and it has a default admin and password. A lot of the time those are not changed. So this is a really big weakness that can affect lots of different devices. We see unnecessarily exposed surfaces. Good example of this would be, say, an office printer, which is plugged into the Ethernet so anyone can access it within the building or outside of the building possibly. But that printer might have things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth enabled, which are never used for its intended purpose in that office setting, but they create unnecessarily exposed surfaces for attackers to get into it, again, that secure network. We see insecure communications being used. Sometimes this is unavoidable for legacy equipment or equipment that has to interface with legacy equipment, I should say. But often we see modern devices just having an insecure communication because sometimes it's easier to implement. So something like Bluetooth just works, for example, where there's not really a robust authentication protocol. And then another one is intentional backdoors. A really great example of this I like to give is occasionally I do this sort of thing using a voice recorder. This is from the instruction manual that I got with my voice recorder. And in here it talks about changing the password. And there's a huge backdoor here. It says, if you forget your password, just enter 181818 and press the button for 3 seconds and it cracks it. Somebody decided to build that in case users forget their password, but because this is the same across all of the products, it effectively gets rid of the purpose of there being a password on the products because anybody who knows about this backdoor can just get around it. Okay, so let's look at the legislation then. The reason that we're all here on this call today is because the rules say we have to do something. We're here to learn about the minimum mandatory requirements, and this differs depending on which geography you are in, or rather into which geography you are selling your products. So in the EU, the Radio Equipment Directive was published many, many years ago. This is prior to Brexit, so the UK had an obligation to copy that into UK law, and that's what the UK did. They published the Radio Equipment Regulations. The Radio Equipment Directive then had a delegated regulation published a few years back, which added some cybersecurity requirements. This was post-Brexit, so the UK didn't have an obligation to copy that into UK law and did not. The Cyber Resilience Act was since published, and again, that's just an EU thing. The UK didn't make a copy of that, but separately, the UK published the PSTI regime, the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Regime. And the ones highlighted in blue here, these are the ones that have cybersecurity requirements in place. So let's look at the PSTI and what products it applies to. So the applicability statement here, it talks about relevant connectable products made available to consumers. So this is just for consumer products. So it doesn't cover sort of business to business type sales, and it defines a consumer as an individual acting for purposes wholly or mainly outside of that individual's business. And then the applicability of the Radio Equipment Directive, well, first of all, it just applies to radio equipment, nothing else. There's no limitation here on whether it's a consumer product or B2B, just any piece of radio equipment, as long as it falls into one of three additional categories. The first one we're seeing on the screen here is internet connected radio equipment. We'll go into more detail on what these categories are later on, but there are three of them. One is internet connected. The second one is radio equipment that processes certain categories of personal data and is either internet connected, used for childcare, is a toy, or is worn on a body. And then the third category is a sort of a subcategory of the first. It's internet connected radio equipment that enables the holder to transfer money or virtual currency. And then I will briefly touch on the Cyber Resilience Act here because the scope of this is worth mentioning. It's incredibly wide. This regulation applies to products with digital elements, the intended purpose or reasonably foreseeable use of which includes a direct or indirect, logical or physical data connection to a device or network. So effectively what we're saying there is any electronic product that talks to any other electronic product is in scope of the CRA. Save for a few specific exemptions, but the vast majority of electronic products will be covered by the CRA. Because this is quite a complex subject, we've put together a flow diagram that helps identify which pieces of legislation apply to each product. These slides will be made available, so you don't need to screenshot this. We'll send a copy of this out. And then it's worth just looking at the timeline as well. So this is where we are now, the orange lines on the right-hand side. So we're middle of July 2026. If we wind the clock right back to June 2020, that's when we had a standard EN 303645 published. And this really was the first standard that gave a baseline set of requirements for any type of electronic product, mainly aimed at consumer products. But 303645 wasn't mandatory. There was nothing that said you had to meet this standard. It was just a voluntary thing that people could do if they wanted to. In October 2021, that's when we had the Red Delegated Act published. It didn't come into effect for several years. But in between, we had the PSTI Act published in 2022, the PSTI regulations published in 23, and then those two pieces of legislation actually became mandatory in April 2024. So that's a very, very short time period between December 22 and April 24, between the regulations being published and them actually becoming law. We'll come back to that later on because the requirements are quite easy to meet. So it's not too much of an issue that it's so quick. In August of 2024, we had the EN 18031 series of standards published. These are the standards which were harmonised under the Radio Equipment Directive. So that's what the majority of people are applying in order to meet those red requirements in that delegated act. And then in quite quick succession after that, September 2024, we had the Cyber Trust Scheme that was launched. This is an FCC scheme, so completely outside of Europe and the UK. It's just worth mentioning because it gives us an example of other geographies which will start to have these cybersecurity requirements brought in fairly soon. The only trouble with the Cyber Trust Mark is nobody really knows what's happening with it. So there was a labeling administrator who was appointed as the lead administrator for that scheme. That was UL. Since then, UL and the FCC have had some fallings out over UL's deep ties to China, in the FCC's words. So they were sort of kicked off as being the lead administrator. No one's quite sure what's happening with that scheme, but someone else needs to come along and write the rules effectively. We then had the Cyber Resilience Act published in November 2024. And then after that, that's when the pieces of legislation started kicking in properly. So the Red Delegated Act became law in 2025, August 2025. So anyone manufacturing or marketing radio equipment that falls into those three categories should have been meeting those requirements since August 2025. The next date that everyone's looking forward to now is September 2026. That's when the Cyber Resilience Act reporting obligations come into effect. In next week's presentation, we'll cover that in a bit more detail. And then in December 2027, that's when the Cyber Resilience Act comes into full force. All of the requirements under there become mandatory. And on the same day, those Red Delegated Act requirements will get repealed. So you won't have to meet both sets of requirements at the same time. Okay, so that was quite a quick recap over the various bits of legislation, what they apply to, what the timeline is. But now let's dive into two of those in more detail. We'll look at the PSTI and we'll look at the Radio Equipment Directive. Obviously, not covering the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, in today's session in much detail. That's what we'll cover next week when Mustafa gives his presentation then. So the PSTI requirements for the UK then. We talked earlier about how this just applies to consumer products, but it's not every consumer product. It's relevant connectable consumer products. So what do we mean by connectable? The rules get a little bit messy at this point, but it splits that up into two subcategories. So we have an internet connectable product or a network connectable product. Now, Internet connectable is defined as a product which is capable of connecting to the internet using a communication protocol that forms part of the IP suite, the Internet Protocol Suite, to send and receive data. So effectively, it is a product which itself communicates with the internet using the IP protocol. The second category there is network connectable product, and that's then further divided into two separate categories. So first of all, it says it's not an internet connectable product, but it defines it into two different connectability conditions. And it says it meets the first connectability condition if it's capable of connecting directly to an internet connectable product by means of a protocol that forms part of the IP suite. So it doesn't necessarily talk to the internet, but it talks to an internet connectable product using something like TLS or TCP/IP or Wi-Fi, for example. And then the second connectability condition is it's capable of connecting directly to two or more products at the same time by using a protocol that doesn't form part of the IP suite, and it's capable of connecting directly to an internet connectable product by one of those protocols. So it gets a little bit difficult to follow here, but that's our second network connectable condition, is it uses another protocol, so not part of the IP suite, to communicate directly with an internet connectable product, and it can connect to two or more products at the same time. If it doesn't meet any of these three conditions, then it's not in scope of PSTI, even though it's a piece of consumer electronics. To try to explain that in a bit of a better way, because it's quite difficult to follow, imagine this sort of typical setup that you might get in a home, for example. So we've got the internet, that cloud in the top right corner, and that would come into the home via generally something like a Wi-Fi router. Yeah, there might be fiber modems and bits in between, but let's say it comes into a router, and that will then connect to various other bits and pieces, and the web sort of expands out. Now, some of these are quite clearly internet connectable products. So the router is internet connectable. If you have something like a laptop, that's obviously designed to browse the internet, for example, so that is internet connectable. A smartphone would be internet connectable, and that might either go through the router or it might just connect to the internet itself using its 4G or 5G connection. And we might have other devices in there like an IP-facing webcam, for example, that would be considered internet connectable. Some of the devices on here would meet that first network connectable condition because they use an IP protocol to communicate directly with one of those blue internet connectable products. So the examples here would be something like a home hi-fi system might connect to the router. You might have some network storage. You might have other network cameras. You could have something like a temperature monitoring system or a smart thermostat, for example. These sort of devices would be network connectable. One. A lot of the devices on here are just not in scope. So things like a USB keyboard or a USB camera, they're communicating directly with an internet connectable product, but they're not communicating to two or more products at the same time. So they can't be in scope. And then things like the actual smart sensors that would sit off the back of that hub at the top left there, they are communicating with two or more products at the same time, but not communicating directly with an internet connectable product. So they're not in scope either. The same thing for the sort of CD player option we've got down at the bottom right. The only one here that would be network connectable to would be a set of Bluetooth headphones, for example, that could connect to a CD player and a smartphone at the same time. So it's communicating to two or more products at the same time, and at least one of those is an internet connectable product. So that would put that into network connectable to category. So now we know what products are covered by the PSTI, what do those products actually have to do? I said earlier that the legislation came in quite quickly, or rather it came into effect quite quickly, and that would normally be a problem. So if something like the Radio Equipment Directive or the Cyber Resilience Act came into effect quite quickly, manufacturers would just not have the time to keep up. The PSTI actually had very few requirements, and therefore many manufacturers were able to meet these. So the first requirement is that the product should not have universal default passwords. So that's what we talked about earlier on, isn't it? If you get rid of the admin and password combination, then it makes a lot of devices a lot more secure. It also says you shouldn't link this to things like the serial number or the MAC address or anything that's publicly available. You should have a proper, genuinely unique password for each product. The second requirement under PSTI is that the manufacturer must publish information on their minimum security update. So you must say when you sell the product, I will continue to provide security updates for X number of months or X number of years. Interestingly, there's no requirement on how long that period could be. So you could, if you wanted to, say you'll just provide updates for 10 seconds. And as long as you publish that, you still meet PSTI. And then the third requirement is that you have to publish information on how to report security issues. So if a person buys your product, or even if they don't buy it, but if they find an issue with your product, they have to be able to report that to you, and you have to publish how they're going to do that when they'll receive updates, for example. So that's the third requirement, is having this vulnerability reporting procedure. The fourth requirement, and this is the last one in here, there are only four. The fourth requirement is that you must publish a statement of compliance saying that you meet the PSTI effectively and what category your product is. So that's the fourth requirement, is that statement of compliance. If you do all four of these things, that's it. You've met PSTI in full. So that's why it wasn't really a concern that it came in quite quickly, because there is only one technical requirement, it's not having default passwords. Just on that statement of compliance for a moment, if you look at, for example, the information that has to go in your CE marking declaration or your UKCA marking declaration, compare that with what needs to go in the PSTI statement of compliance, there's quite a lot of overlap. There's just two extra bits that the PSTI adds in. One is actually declaring it meets the PSTI requirements, and the second is the defined support period for the product. So what a lot of people are doing is just adding one or two sentences to the bottom of their UKCA declaration to say, oh, and we also meet PSTI, and the support period is 12 months. So this is an example from when I worked at Texacom. We did exactly that. We just added this onto the bottom of our DOCs. Okay, we'll now look at the Radio Equipment Directive in a bit more detail and what the requirements are there. Now, the applicability statements here get a little bit more complex because there are three different categories. The first of those is any internet connected radio equipment. And this has caused a lot of arguments over what is internet connected, what is not internet connected. So we'll come back to this in a minute and discuss exactly what is in scope and what is probably not in scope. But that's the first requirement. Anything internet connected, Article 3.3D of the Radio Equipment Directive applies to it. The second one then talks about personal data. So any radio equipment that processes certain categories of personal data, and it points out to the GDPR and the e-privacy directive to tell you what that data actually is. If the radio equipment processes those categories of data and is either internet connected, or is designed or intended exclusively for childcare, or is covered by the Toys Directive, or is designed or intended to be worn or strapped to or hung from any part of the body or any clothing, then Article 3.3E applies to that product. The third requirement, or the third category, is internet connected radio equipment that enables the holder or the user to transfer money, monetary value, or virtual currency. Then 3.3F applies to that product. If it's none of those things, then it's not in scope of the Radio Equipment Directive cybersecurity requirements. It will still be in scope of the radio spectrum usage and EMC and safety requirements. Assuming it is radio equipment, obviously, if you're manufacturing non-radio equipment, you obviously don't need to meet the Radio Equipment Directive. That said, it might be a good idea to start looking at some of these standards anyway, because they will help you get close to meeting the cyber resilience act, which Rustin will cover in his talk next week. Right, let's look at this diagram again then, but frame that in terms of the Radio Equipment Directive. So if we go through the same exercise, some of these devices are clearly internet connected because they are intended to communicate via the internet. So things like the Wi-Fi router, a laptop, an internet-facing security camera, or a smartphone, for example, very clearly internet connected products. It doesn't really make sense to highlight the ones on here which process personal information or handle financial assets, because that's less about where they appear in this diagram and more about what they actually do. The only caveat there being that the ones that handle financial assets can only be a subset of those that are internet connected, because that's what the definition says. However, some of the products on here, you can ask the question over whether these actually are internet connected, because the Radio Equipment Directive doesn't say anything about using IP protocol. It just talks about sending and receiving data over the internet. So you could ask, well, would something like a webcam be in scope? Would a keyboard be in scope? Would all these smart sensors be in scope? If you think about the webcam, for example, or a headset or a keyboard, the information you put into that device, whether it's video, audio, or keystrokes, that information does make its way over the internet. Just like I am talking to a microphone now, that audio data is making its way across the internet to all of you watching this webinar. So does that mean that the microphone is internet connected radio equipment? Well, it's a good question, and one that wasn't particularly well defined. However, there is a draft red guide that's expected to be published fairly soon, and this does try to give a little bit of clarity to that question. Now, unfortunately, the draft red guide isn't a public document, so I can't share it. However, ADCO Red, so the Administrative Cooperation Group, so this is the group of market surveillance authorities for Red, they've got together, created a very, very similar guide, which is public, and actually uses all the same diagrams that are in the red guide as well. So thankfully, I can share these diagrams with you today. I'll only share a subset, but you can go and get a copy of this document, or I can point you to it if you need me to. It talks about various scenarios for products which would be in scope and might be out of scope of this internet connected question. And it all hinges on whether the protocol it uses is internet ready or non-internet ready. Now, it doesn't specifically say an IP protocol suite like the PSTI does, but it's effectively the same question. So let's look at some examples. These are some examples of products which would be in scope. So here we've got the equipment A, which is the thing that we're seeing whether is in scope or not. If it talks to some intermediate equipment B, which then allows it to communicate with the internet, and it does all of that using an internet-ready protocol, then it puts it in scope of the requirements. And that's regardless of whether it's using a wired connection or a wireless connection to communicate with that intermediate equipment. Because that's another question that kept coming up. If it's internet connected, but that internet connectivity has nothing to do with the radio, is it still in scope? And the answer is yes. It doesn't have to be internet connected via means of radio. It just has to be radio equipment and internet connected. They're two separate conditions. If we look now at some other examples from that guide, if the product was communicating again with some intermediate equipment, but was doing that using a non-internet ready protocol, then that would mean it's probably out of scope. And the reason I'm saying probably is because the guidance documents don't say it's out of scope. It always defers out to the manufacturer and says, you go and do a risk assessment, you figure out whether it's in scope or not, which I appreciate is not hugely helpful, but it at least steers you in the right direction. So critically here, the equipment A is using a non-internet ready protocol to talk to equipment B. So that will be using something like standard Bluetooth, for example, to talk to the intermediate equipment, and that then enables the internet communication. So something like, I've not got it on at the minute, but if I had my wireless headset on, that will be talking to my laptop via Bluetooth. Yes, the audio is going across the internet, but it's not using an internet ready protocol. unless it was doing something really clever like using BNEP, so network encapsulation, but I guess most devices don't do that. And a lot of people will have products that fall into this category of using something like Bluetooth to talk to a smartphone to enable internet connectivity, but the product itself is probably not considered internet connected for red. Okay, if you do fall under the red requirements, what do you actually have to do? What must the product do to meet red cyber requirements? There are three bullet points under the essential requirements, 3.3D, E, and F, which apply to those three different categories of equipment. And in here it says, must not harm the network, must safeguard data, and must protect against fraud. Now, these are quite vague requirements, but all of the red requirements are. If you look up a few lines in there, it says efficiently use and effectively use spectrum. It doesn't talk about decibels or megahertz or milliwatts, anything like that. All of that is covered in the harmonized standards. So the things you have to do are protect the network, protect data privacy, and protect against fraud. The way you do that is by testing to a standard, probably a harmonized standard. Now, while we're on the subject of harmonized standards, it's important to talk about the different conformity assessment procedures that RED makes available to you, because the conformity assessment procedures you can choose will differ depending on whether you apply the harmonized standard in full or not. If we look at the different articles in RED, so 3.1 and 3.4 cover EMC, safety, and common charger requirements. You can use any of these three modules that are defined in the annexes of the RED. And Module A, internal production control, doesn't need a notified body. So that's the easier one, whereas Module B plus C or Module H both need a notified body. So people generally try to avoid those where possible. So most people for Article 3.1 and 3.4 always default to Module A. For Article 3.2 and Article 3.3, if you apply the harmonized standard in full, then again you can use any of these. Most people therefore go for Module A. If you've not applied the harmonized standard in full, you've got to go to a notified body, either for Module B plus C or for Module H. And that's why the majority of people for 3.2 and 3.3 really try to meet that harmonized standard. And for the cybersecurity requirements, there are three harmonized standards, 18031-1, -2, and -3, which cover those three sets of requirements we looked at earlier. Within these standards, there are about 13 or so different mechanism types that the products could support. Things like authentication, secure updates, secure communication. There's a lot in there about logging and deletion and user notification for the data protection side of things. And then we have cryptographic keys and cryptography. The different requirements under RED have a different subset of those mechanisms that could apply, and that's what the different standards cover. Those 18031 standards ask for a lot of documentation. So within the standards, you'll see a lot of references to an e.info. That's extra information that the manufacturer has to provide to the assessment body to let them carry out the assessment, the testing. And something else which is unique to these 18031 standards is a set of decision trees. Some of you might have seen this already, but within each of those mechanisms, there are one or multiple different decision trees which you have to run through for your product. And most of these start with a for each statement. Now, some of these statements talk about for each user interface that's on the product. Well, that's easy enough to get a list of, but a lot of these talk about network assets and security assets. So then before you can even go through these decision trees and work out whether you pass or fail or the requirement is not applicable, you need to know what that list of network assets or security assets is for your product. I'd like to be able to tell you that that is an easy process to go through to identify all those assets, but the truth is it's not. It's quite complex. We've put together a freely available asset identification guide. We've partnered with a company called Security Pattern to do that. You can go onto our website and get a copy of this, but it talks through how to generate those lists of assets. If I look at this is a diagram that we put together for the security assets and network assets from the -1 standard. Everything depends on various functions on the product, whether that's a security function or a network function. The -2 standard has similar definitions. The -3 standard again has similar ones. There's a weird circular reference in the -3 that everyone's just glossing over for now. But what we're doing in this guide is we almost flip this diagram. We start from the right-hand side, come up with a full list of all the functions, start to filter those, list the parameters, filter those again. Through this process, we generate a complete list of all the assets without adding things in unnecessarily or without missing things. And this, in our experience, is a really great way to make sure that we're covering everything correctly and you're not having to go back through this loop when you're halfway through the assessment and add back bits in that you needed to or take bits out. We've also got a template for those decision trees that we showed on the previous slides. We've actually combined this asset identification functionality into this same template as well. So it talks you through identifying all the functions, filtering those, identifying things like the interfaces and the cryptography used on the product. Once you've done all of that, it tells you everything that should go into those decision trees. And then it's just a case of you running through and answering the yes or no questions to each entry in there. These are all freely available as well, so do please reach out to us and you can get yourselves a copy of these. I said I wouldn't talk about the Cyber Resilience Act. I'll leave that for Mussolini next week, but really quickly, just want to recap the scope of this. If we think about that diagram we had on the previous page, we can simplify that for CRA, because if you have any digital product communicating with any other digital product, it's in scope of CRA. So pretty much every manufacturer will need to worry about this fairly soon. And how soon is that? Well, if we think back to that timeline we showed, yes, December 2027 is the proper deadline when everything comes into effect. But actually, September 11th this year is when the reporting obligations come into effect. And that is 58 days from now. So, not a lot of time. So if you're not aware of what those reporting obligations are, I would say panic now, listen to our presentation next week, and hopefully the panic will subside afterwards. So I realise I was slightly over time, so I'll just quickly summarise. Look, this legislation is here, it's here to stay, and it's expanding in scope. So if anyone thinks we can just bury our head in the sand and wait for this to blow over, that's not going to happen. It's definitely a thing that we all need to worry about. The compliance requirements differ depending on geography. So we're starting now to see UKCA marking and CE marking gradually diverge. That will only increase in future. Those reporting obligations do come into effect in September 2026, 50-something days from now. And then the key thing really is that, yes, it's complex to demonstrate compliance with these standards and this legislation, but there are resources available, there are tools available to help you with this. Please do reach out to us. We can make those available to you. And just the very last thing to say is that we do have a white paper as well, which covers some of these requirements in a little bit more detail, so you can scan to download that. And that's me finished now. So please do register for our webinar next week. It's the 22nd of July, 3 o'clock PM. CRA, are you ready for 2027? Thank you.